see something's happening now. So if you can make that larger, yeah. So I have a few, the numbering is off, as with Asiyah, some formatting changes. I have a few simple points to make about that, about this topic, that big overlap with what Asiyah has said before. So a few words on trust. I won't say much because she's covered that. But I take a semantic spectrum. She showed a little bit of semantic spectrum. So I include a range of semantic resources besides ontology because they turn out to be important as part of ontology. So vocabulary is obviously part of ontologies. So I take a somewhat broader view about how these things interrelate. And you do that, you quickly get into a great complexity. And so a fellow named Morton discussed the idea of a hypermodel, things that are very complex and hard to essentially coordinate information about. So a little bit about that, and I'll talk a little bit about, as Asiyah did, on illustrating finding, assessing, and interoperating with ontologies and other semantic resources. And finally, a few brief thoughts on the metadata aspect of alignment and harmonization. So next slide, please. This next slide is a slide on trust, and essentially Asiyah covered this, so I won't reproduce what she said about it. From my point of view, the important thing about that is you can think of this as a good project. A well-managed technical project is one that builds trust. And so you have to have all these elements, from it being transparent, who's responsible for what, making sure that you're serving user needs, making sure that the project can go on, and whatever repository that you have for semantic resources can go on, as well as the technology. And again, Asiyah showed us some examples of the technology. Next slide. Next slide is a complex slide, but don't worry too much about it. What I did is I took a slide that sort of explains the FAIR process and the flow from F to R. And I simply replaced the word data with something relevant for semantics, like FAIR semantic resources, replacing data with concepts and showing a ontology. You would show an ontology rather than a data table, so forth. So this slide essentially just gives you a little bit of an idea about what happens if we do that. Well, for example, on findability and accessibility, we need citable semantic resources, and we need them related because some semantic resources are vocabularies and others are the richer ontologies, and they have to be aligned and related. Interoperability is divided into two parts, and so for data, you want things like an open syntax, but here we want to have common open semantics that can deal with ontologies themselves, semantic resources themselves. And then we need ways of mapping between ontologies and even broader into various semantic resources. Next slide, which is another view of FAIR. And again, Asiyah covered this, as well as showing the spectrum. So again, I've been talking about things at the bottom that are things like glossaries, definitions, all along the continuum up to ontologies with strong semantics. And when we think of it in terms of FAIR, at least I think of it in terms of FAIR, metadata is one of the things that really stands out about this, as well as if we are talking about the spectrum, how do we make these interoperate and align and make sure that we can access all the related semantic resources that are involved in this. There's actually some old issues here, because way back, even 20 years ago or so, people were talking about the need for ontology libraries, well-managed, project-oriented. So next slide. Now, how fair are ontologies? Asiyah made the point that OBO foundry ontologies look pretty fair. I agree with that. But I just wanted to point out that one analysis for OBO ontologies that was done for disaster ontologies, things dealing with emergencies and crises. This was done by Azimi and his colleagues. And they found that these disaster ontologies, as far as they could tell, applying some of the principles that Asiyah again had a slide about, they don't seem to be that fair as a whole. Now, of course, these are ontologies over a long period of time, but the publication is recent, just last year. Some of the ontologies are a bit older. And so they did some fairness tests along the standards that have been developed, the tests that have been developed. They found that findability using 4 criteria was very low, 1.8%. That wouldn't be the case with OBO. But the accessibility was only a little bit larger. in dealing with APIs. And in terms of the detailed explicit mappings and correspondences between ontologies, which is the metadata schema issues, they found very low. A surprising statistic, according to them at least, was that 90% of URIs artifacts do not conform to the principle of uniqueness and persistence. So some of these are temporary projects and so forth, but they don't represent good long-range projects. So next slide. Okay. So this is just a slide similar to what Asiyah showed you before, using, if I want to try to find things, and I take a non-biomedical example. I took an environment because I worked in that area as part of ESEP. I just looked to find things about environmental ontologies. And of course, we found in the Foundry, I found 9 ontologies, ENVO being an important one. Looking at the ontology lookup service, OLS, which is an obvious place for people to go, I found a slightly larger set, a lot of overlap. It had a few more specific things like livestock. So they have a different look, of course, and feel, but essentially you can find things knowing if you know something about ontology repository. Next slide. Okay, so here's the discussion of hyper objects, Morton's idea about big knowledge. It came with thinking about what we know about a hyper object like the human brain. And the idea that that this is a massive object informationally as well as in reality. It's distributed in time and space. That is, processes go over time and they're related to the brain. And it tends to transcend localization. But to me, this idea applies also to the ontological semantic world of models that we're building. And on the left-hand side of it, I have a few examples of some of the objects that are sort of related, that for any particular domain sort of tries to capture the knowledge of what we know about that. So starting at the bottom, we have these glossaries. We might have ontology design patterns, small things that can be reused. We have specific domain ontologies like Cyto and Photo and Vito, which was mentioned there. And then we have the upper level ones like disease ontologies and infectious disease. And then we have the basics like BFO and so forth. And there are flows between them. So to me, an ongoing issue is how to handle this massive growth, which will make sort of semantic hyper objects over digital objects. Next slide. And I just illustrate that a little bit with some examples. So here, these are some places that I might go and find things. And as I do, I might find slightly different information about them in these particular things. So the OBO Foundry, the Bioportal we mentioned before, good repositories. There are places where we have ODPs, ontology design patterns, and modules. There are GitHubs for particular projects, portals like AgriPortal, and many tools like Ontobee, which were shown before, as well as FairShare, which is being maintained. One of the things about that is that some of them have unique IDs, hopefully maintained within the system, but there isn't necessarily one master ID that people might understand, because these efforts are giving IDs to what they have within them. And on the right side, I just have examples of some of the massive types of objects, digital objects, that are related in a topic like COVID and COVID-19 terms. Next slide, please. I'm almost done. Interoperability. A few words about interoperability to finish up. I think I have 3 slides here. So and this is obviously coming from something like a protege view of disease ontology. And on the right side, we see a range of metadata that is known for the disease ontology. So I call it the hyperobject documents. So we have links to all these things in terms of definitions, links. We have links to cross-references, and we have synonyms. So it just gives a small example. And again, within a particular related place, there might be a different ID for references. So for example, there is a taxonomic ID that you could find more about SARS-CoV in that place. This is good and bad in the sense it does show you where to go if you think of it in terms of hyper-object relationships. But it is difficult. There are issues of managing that complexity. Next slide, which is a little bit on metadata. And to me, over time, we're going to have to go beyond the word level, the single concept word level definition. So AgroPortal, for example, has identified a whole range of properties, vocabulary that could be used to describe different aspects of ontology. Early work on this area included the ontology metadata vocabulary, OMV, and it's been replaced by an upgraded metadata for ontology descriptions. These all seem relevant. I have an example of some of the metadata that you might have. So what's the domain, or within a domain, you might drill down from agriculture to farming, a more specific part. The group that is involved, like OVO, obviously, and then we have things like the languages involved, license used, tools used, and so forth. There's a range of metadata to find things. You might want to find things in a particular language like Spanish or French. So that's relevant. Next slide, which is my last slide. So an open question: do we need more ontological semantics to align and relate ontologies? We have these very simple concepts for matching, equivalence, subsumption, and disjointedness. But there are a lot of work, and Asiyah mentioned a recent one that was at the ICPO session, I guess, on Sunday. I cite an article from 2020 on logical alignment and evaluating. That's something to keep track of. There are many alignment tools, but how good are the semantics of the relationships there? And I end with noting that there are some relations between ontology design patterns, such as the ontology design language, OPLA, developed. And maybe we'll hear a little bit more about these things open. So that concludes my presentation. We can turn it back to Asiyah for our next speaker, which I see is Asiyah is online. So welcome, Asiyah.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I'm going to do is because this I need to download your slides to the computer so that you have a better representation of your slides, because the Google doesn't interrupt with the PowerPoint. Is that okay? We can take like 5 minutes break. Hello? Hello?
This is for Asiyah, right?
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay, so let's take 5 minutes break when I'm ready, and then I will call you to present. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Do you want to use that time to see if there's any questions or comments on this? So, for example, Devin Donaldson might be there. Devin Donaldson might be there, and his area is trust and trust repositories, and he might have some words to say for us while we're waiting.
Yeah, please go ahead, ask a question to Gary if you have any.
Or just making a point of things that you know that we might be aware of.
Okay.
Hi, Gary. Okay, can you hear us?
He cannot hear us? Hello?
Hello?
Gary? Yeah, we are trying to ask question to Gary.
Okay.
I can hear you. It was a little faint. Was that Oliver? It was a little kind of faint.
Yeah. Okay, so just want to initiate this discussion. So the trust, I mean, we have fairness, right? Fairness principle, and the trust principle, appears to be a new one, right? Initiated by NIH, right? Daily, yeah.
Okay.
So, what's the relationship between the fairness and the trust principles?
I can say one thing about that, but again, Devin may be there. We probably could say more. So, reusability, for example, the R of fair is essentially very much involved in trust, or trust is very much involved in people being willing to or wanting to reuse something or other. So again, on my point about that was that I tend to think of trust being earned by repositories that are well managed, and therefore the resources, whether they be data or semantic resources like vocabularies and so forth, being well maintained. I might invest in them if I know that they're going to have a long period of time, so I can use it. They're going to be updated, they're going to be improved, and so forth. So for all those things are the way I think that trust gets involved in this. Over time, for example, if I trust a resource like Obo Foundry, I will find things in it. When I have a topic, I'll go there first. I might use OLS again because I trust that they will find things out there that I might not be aware of. So those are my initial thoughts. I see that Anu has her hand up.
Yeah, I just want to add to the comment of differences between FAIR and trust. I think an easy way to think of FAIR is that FAIR is more for data software, like individual digital assets, right? Trust is more for the repositories that actually host these FAIR assets. So,
No, I think it's Mike's problem. You are talking to the mic.
I can hear her.
oh, okay.
I can hear you.
I
well.
wasn't sure because I could
No.
hear Asiyah
No,
in the
we are
background.
listening. We are listening.
Yes.
All right. So yeah, so that's I was a little involved also with.
Well,
you
let me
know,
push back on one point there, that when you think of FAIR, it's for data. So, you know, the idea here is that we're opening the question of FAIR should be for other resources.
Right.
including-
I sorry, just to
Yes.
answer that, I think FAIR is for more, let me, it in my mind for digital assets. It could be data, it could be software. I believe, you know, so application of FAIR to software is being worked out now. I heard from Asiyah recently that you guys are thinking about FAIR and ontology. So any digital asset, I'm assuming, could have the FAIR principles applied to them. Is that right?
I agree entirely that it is the digital objects, digital aspects of that we want. That's a good way of identifying the scope.
Okay,